Everyone to take your seats once again. We're about ready to begin the panel discussion. And I'd ask you to double check that your cell phones are turned off or on vibrate as well. And then we can begin.
And you were Prime Minister of your
Okay,
country.
could I ask for everyone's attention, please?
For how long?
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a pleasure for me to have the chance to give the panel discussion moderation today to someone I consider a very good friend, as well as a very close partner also of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, Dr. SolomonPassy. Many of you know who he is. He's one of these individuals who I think needs no introduction. I will probably introduce him at a later point with his full bio, but the key facts for now: former Foreign Minister of Bulgaria, where he was actually responsible for Bulgaria entering NATO, European Union, had many successes while he was foreign minister. Currently the president of the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria, I think the most active NGO in Bulgaria, is safe to say. Amazing the activity that they're doing. Also, he's serving as the head of the branch of ICD in Sofia. So it's a very close partnership, actually, between the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria and the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. Dr. Passy is also a member of the advisory board of ICD and very, very active in terms of our delegation trips around the world. We have one coming up very soon in terms of lecturing, in terms of also work with young leaders. So it's really a very special honor to give the chairmanship of this panel to Dr. SolomonPassy. The panel, as you know, is focused on economic bridges as a tool to promote peace and prosperity. Case study, the Middle East. So ladies and gentlemen, if you could please give a warm welcome for all of the panelists, and in particular, Dr. SolomonPassy. Thank you.
I don't need mic, do I? Okay. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be in such a distinguished panel, starting with my colleague, the Honorable Yasar. I would like to say that I'm very thankful to Minister Yakis for his great support which he extended to Bulgaria when Bulgaria was a candidate to join NATO. We received a very, very strong Turkish support, and this happened exactly in the period when he was minister, 2002, 2003. Bulgaria at that time got both the invitations to join NATO and made the necessary preparations. I haven't met before Tom Dolev, who is from the Paris Peace Center. This is my new friend. So I'm looking forward to establish a cooperation with him. But I happen to know the head of the Paris Peace Center, Shimon Peres, who is a Nobel Prize winner and who is one of the leaders of the peace process in the Middle East in the last several decades. Really an impressive personality. So thank you very much for representing your great organization here. And finally, we have immediately on my left, it is written the Honorable Said Musa, but he is not only honorable, he is right honorable, because he happened to be two terms, Prime Minister of his country, of Belize, which is one of the most impressive countries on the world. It is a mixture and combination of number of influences. Influence from the Brits, they are a member of the Commonwealth, influence from the Spaniards, influence from the Mayans, influence from the Caribbean. This is a unique laboratory for cultural diplomacy, Mark, so I very much encourage you to open a chapter of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy in Belize. Now we have to talk about the economic bridges as tool to promote peace and prosperity, but speaking in the Middle East. But speaking about the Middle East, I cannot start with something else but with Syria. This is the most topical thing that happens today. This is Syria is boiling, and I remember very much the intervention of the Western allies and NATO in particular in 2003, when we helped the Iraqi people to get liberated from their dictator. This paved the way to the Arab Springs and to the democratic process in the Arab countries and in the Middle East. And now I would like to ask our panelists one question. do you think that we have the right, we, the West, or we in coalition of willing, or in what format, do we have the right to liberate the Syrians from their president, from their, I would call it, inherited president, from their, I'm not afraid to say dictator, because I myself was living in a dictatorship for 33 years, and I know very well what this dictatorship means. So, gentlemen, I'm expecting your answers. Minister Yakis.
Thank you very much. Actually, the responsibility to protect is something that starts to be developed since very recently only. The other method of dealing with this question is another principle which survived since the Westphalia Treaty in 1649. The nationhood, the sovereignty within the national boundaries, is a concept which developed with the signature of the Westphalia Treaty, and that from that time on, since is it now 350 years, this system proved its validity. So whatever happens within the boundaries of a country was that country's responsibility, and the other countries were not allowed to be part of this dispute of whatever is taking place within that country. Now, responsibility to protect is something which goes against this concept of national sovereignty. And we have to test it. In the case of Iraq, we did it, or the West international community did it, but at what cost? We have to see it. Millions of people were made homeless, and hundreds of thousands of people were innocent civilians that were not part of the dispute, that were not part of the Saddam regime, or that were not part of the Ba'athist regime, were killed and deprived. Many children were made orphans, and many wives were made widowers. So we have to compare the cost and the benefits. We cannot show the Iraqi case as a good example of the doing the right things by the international community for a good cause. The cause may be good, but we have to compare it with the price which is paid for it. The second incident of this test of the responsibility to protect was in Libya. Libya is at present in turmoil, and those weapons which were distributed to the opposition to Gaddafi are being used now for other purposes, both within Libya and in the surrounding countries. And the outcome is not to the entire satisfaction of many people in the international community. Syria is more complicated than the others. Why? Because in Syria, unlike in Iraq and in Libya, and perhaps to a certain extent in Egypt, the division is not people against Saddam and Gaddafi and Mubarak, but in Syria, the destiny of the political regime, Bashar Assad and his surrounding, and the army, and the security and the intelligence are so tied to each other that if one falls, most probably the others will also fall. When these four elements fall, then the country is likely to fall into chaos. Now that we are lamenting that each passing day there are 60 or 100 people killed. When the country falls into chaos, perhaps there will be 300 people killed each passing day. And it is not easy to substitute the present, this quadro, that's to say regime, army, police, security, and intelligence. To create an army, it takes years, perhaps, if not a decade. So without finding a substitution to the present regime and the army, etc., it may not be appropriate to let the regime fall, and we cannot say that let's bring down this regime and we will think the remainder later on. We cannot do this. So I will stop here and say that the Syrian question is more complicated than the others, and we should be careful in bringing down Bashar Assad regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Now, Prime Minister, what is your opinion on that?
I'm afraid my opinion is far more simplistic. And I understand fully what my distinguished predecessor was saying a while ago. Clearly, when you're dealing with international affairs of this kind, the first principle that comes to mind, in which all of us are guided by, in particularly small states, is that of the right of non-interference or in internal affairs of another state. But having said that, and having feel that that is very fundamental to maintaining peace in the world, we have to face reality as well. And when we look at what is happening in a country like Syria, where it is very clear to me, and I have the luxury of being an outsider way across the Atlantic, but the luxury of that perspective allows me to see things I want to suggest a little clearer, that it is clear that the people want this regime to go. They are suffering. And I think the international community has a humanitarian obligation to assist in this change. This is my view.
Thank you very much. And now we have not only difference of geographical or geopolitical viewpoints, we obviously have a difference of generational difference of viewpoints. So after we spoke with former minister and former prime minister, I hope that we're giving now the word to the future foreign minister and future prime minister, maybe of Israel to start with. So we are expecting your view, Tom.
So thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be here with such experienced and distinguished guests such as these. First, let me say a bit what my perspective is and what I hope to represent and where I come from. So I'm obviously Israeli, and I come from the Paris Center for Peace, but part of the reason I'm here is because I'm part of a community which started as an online community and is now coming into more physical terms called Yalla, and it is a cross-Middle East community, meaning that there are members from Egypt, Palestine, Israel, and from Syria as well. So I think when I try to speak about the situation, it has to do also with how the young people have portrayed their views about Syria on our community and how the Syrians themselves have portrayed it. And in this regard, and obviously these are very difficult issues, and I agree with Mr. Yakis, the Syrian problem is perhaps more difficult than other problems in terms of intervention. But the sense that I get is perhaps more similar to Mr. Musa, and that is that the people themselves do want the regime to be changed, and the young people that we have spoken to and that continue to speak on the page are dissatisfied with the fact that the international community has not intervened. So I would say that I am more to the position that some sort of intervention is necessary, and it's necessary in a short time, even though it's difficult.
Thank you, Tom. And now I wanted to ask, in the break before the beginning of this panel, I talked to one very impressive student who is here in this hall, who had the opportunity to live under two dictators somewhere in Central Asia. Can you tell me how many of us have ever had the opportunity to live under dictatorship? Please raise your hands. One. Two. Three. Yeah, okay. 3 and 4, and I myself, 5. So we're very few of us, we do not have the critical mass of people to create a public opinion, so it will be very difficult for the 5 of us to explain to you what does it mean to live under dictatorship. But having said that, I would very much ask one of those who lived under dictatorship and one of those who haven't experienced this awful experience to to defend the 2 different viewpoints. Who of you believe that the Syrian people has to be supported from outside to get rid of the president? And who of you believe this shouldn't happen? Starting from the first one. Sir, over there is a raised hand.
Thank you very much. My name is Akinola. I'm from Nigeria. I know also that in the past in Nigeria, we were ruled by the military, especially General Sani Abacha, who's late right now. Of course, the whole world knows that democratic setup in Nigeria started in 1999. Up to date, there's no interruption, which I think is bringing a lot of development right now. But then, you know, once you are under the dictatorships, especially under the military, you cannot just criticize them. They do whatever things they like. And of course, that's exactly what is happening in Syria right now. And of course, we all know what happens in these Arab Springs. But the thing that bothers my mind, because I believe the Syrian people need that liberation, is that the West is also biased. Biased in the sense that they're being partial in the way they tackle some of these issues. Now, we also what happened in Libya. The support the West gave, the NATO, where they were to flush Gaddafi out. One expected that such things would have been done in Syria. Of course, one also expected that to have happened in Yemen. We know what happens in the Middle East, except we want to do it for ourselves. We know what happens in Yemen. We know what goes on in Syria. Even in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. We're watching all these things on television. These are issues. We'll expect the West, with all sincerity, in which they used to tackle the one in Libya. But it's like they normally have what you call selective kind of approach. Perhaps they have their interests in one area or the other. I mean, we have to tell ourselves the naked truth. I'm talking from our personal opinion. We know millions innocent people that are being killed in some of these countries. And one expects that the way the West is looking at it, if they really want to fight these things, let them come out and do it holistically and approach it the way they have been approaching other issues in other countries. Because some of these people, they are suffering and they need people to help them. It is a supreme price. Some people have to pay it for it. I listened to him when he talked. So it is supreme, really. We know what happened in Iraq. Innocent people will die. There's no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, it pays. We know what happens also in Libya after Gaddafi was killed. Of course, it's having its own spillover effect. But then that will not mean that the West will have to fold their arms and watch similar things happening in other countries. And they said to turn their eye in the other way around. That to me is not really good enough. That's my own candid opinion for now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. There was another hand raised on our left. Riemann, is that you?
Yeah, my name is Chris. I'm from Berlin. I work for the German government. Talking about Syria, at least I would think about that what the world can do without getting into the country with a military, like NATO or other, in another form. Maybe there could be a prosecution into international crime court like we have for Omar al-Bashir in the Sudan. He cannot travel everywhere and behave like a nice statesperson and sit among other statespersons. In this case, maybe this would be a solution or something to think about. Then there's no reason why in a couple of years or months there could be something happening in Syria like in Rwanda or in Srebrenica before. And the world looked at this and there were soldiers in Rwanda and Srebrenica and nothing what they could do. So this is something one could think about maybe, the ICC. Thanks.
Thank you. And Riemann, what did you suggest? Dr. Prong.
I raised my hand because I was born before the Second World War and Hitler should not be forgotten as a dictator. However, that was different. It was an invader of another country and it was before the UN. So Syria cannot be compared. But anyway, he was a dictator. I agree. You have to base your policies on the basis of common worldwide agreements, consensus. And the R2P principle 2005 is a major basis for policymaking. Now, R2P means two things. A regime has the obligation to protect its people. If a regime is not protecting its people, there's also an international responsibility. The international responsibility can imply intervention, but it ought to be a common agreement, consensus, whether or not ought to be intervened. And secondly, there are many forms of intervention. I don't think you did, Mr. Dolev did not mention military intervention as separate from intervention. He said, I'm in favor of intervention. And also the Prime Minister of Belize didn't say military, he said intervention. So you have to be specific, otherwise, policy-wise, it is not very helpful yet. Just please say something about it. My view is the following. We have made a major mistake with regard to Libya. There was an R2P-based Security Council resolution. There was consensus. Russia and China were not against it. They accepted it, more or less. The West has totally abused that specific resolution by changing the regime. That was a Western view, but they should have come back to the Security Council. And it was very clear in April, May last year, that it would result in a position of Russia and China never to accept such a resolution anymore. Which means we are in disarray at the moment. There is hardly possible world consensus on how to deal with Syria. The most important thing at the moment is political. We need a common view of Russia, the US, and China with all countries in the region, Israel, Iran, yes, Turkey, and others. You have to jump beyond your own shadow. And even if you think that some countries are too powerful in the region, it is important to talk with them in order to have a common position on how to deal, intervention-wise, with Syria, but start with economic intervention. There are many more possibilities for economic intervention, a blockade, for instance, a total freezing of all financial assets, political intervention, diplomatic and cultural intervention. There are many more possibilities before you intervene jointly, indeed militarily. Those have not been used. And the Security Council very often is jumping right away to the decision whether or not to send in the troops, rather than use all the common political instruments which are available. And they may indeed imply Assad leaving the scene. But he will not leave the scene if the Russians do not allow him to leave the scene. So you have to work with the Russians and all the countries in the interest of all countries in the region and also of world peace. So intervention, yes. Be very careful what type of intervention and do it all together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Minister Yakis, and then I'll come back to the raised hand.
Actually, I don't think that the difference between our approaches is so big. I did not exclude the possibility of intervention, but I said that it has to be after a substitute is framed for what's going to happen after the fall of the present regime. If it is not done without this framework, then it may not work. And the international legitimacy is very important. And without the consent of Russia, international legitimacy is not easy. And Russia has strategic interests in Syria. And when you have strategic interests, all the other nice words, responsibility, international responsibility to protect, etc., it is put aside because you interpret these vague terms according to your national strategic interest. What is the strategic interest of Russia? Russia had to withdraw from the Middle East after the dismemberment of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet time, it had a very strong presence. And after the American invasion of Iraq, the prestige or image of the United States in the region has come down to its lowest point, especially with this Abu Ghraib prison incidents. And now there is a golden opportunity for Russia to come back to the region. And if you ask me, which country is the best stepping stone to come back to the region for Russia, I will say it is Syria. Why? Because it is Syria with whom the Soviet Union had the best relations in the region. And I was serving in Syria between 1980 and 84. I witnessed the Hama incidents of 1982. And I know from my friends in Syria that they had very strong relations, especially the members of the army had very strong relations with Russia. They were educated there. They paid several visits. So we see now that the Tartus naval bases remained operational after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with 300 Marines of the Russian Marines staying there. Now it is a constellation which is very favorable for Russia. The constellation, the order of the stars in the sky, comes to the same order only every 276 years. So it's something like this for Russia to come back to the region, and Russia wouldn't like to miss this opportunity. This is one of the main reason for Russia to be adamant or to be strong supporter of Bashar al-Assad. The other reason why Russia is supporting Bashar al-Assad is that Russia does not want this right or responsibility to protect to become a very widely accepted international rule. Let's say we have done it in Lebanon, in Libya, now in Syria, and tomorrow, if people go to the uprising in Chechnya, then international community will say that, look, we have done it in Libya, we have done it in Syria, why don't we do it for Chechnya? So Russia does not want this responsibility to protect to become a widespread rule. Same thing applies to the position of China. China also fears that in the future, where this charming lady comes from, let's say Xinjiang, if there is similar incident in Xinjiang or in Tibet, the international community will use the same right. So China doesn't want this to happen. For Iran, Iran already spread its influence to Iraq after the withdrawal, to fill the gap created by the withdrawal of Americans from Iraq. It has already a very strong presence through Hezbollah in Lebanon. So for Iran to expand its zone of influence all the way to the Mediterranean, the missing link is Syria. So it doesn't want to see the Syrian regime to fall. So this is Iranian strategic interest. When there are such important strategic interests, then it is difficult, of course, to persuade these countries with these notions which is new and which is not tested, such as responsibility to protect. And for Russia, it is important from the standpoint of the creating international legitimacy. If we understand that international legitimacy means UN Security Council decision, it will not be taken easily without the consent of Russia for the reasons that I mentioned. Iran is very much present in the field. Iran has a tradition and record of destabilizing countries. They have means to do it. They have traditions. They have trained people for that. So Iran can destabilize Syria in their favor. So when you look at all these reasons, without finding a way to persuade either the ICC or another mean, without substituting it with something which will not make the entire country fall into the chaos, we have to be careful and not to precipitate to the results.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think that I have an answer to one of the questions which Minister Yakis raised. Why, if we do something in elsewhere, why don't we do it for Chechnya? In politics, you can always do things that are doable. What is doable somewhere in Africa is not doable in Chechnya. What is doable somewhere in Africa is not doable in Tibet. We have to restrict ourselves just to things that are realistic. So the first question that we shall have to raise is it realistic for a military intervention to liberate Syria? ICC is something that is very nice, but I do not remember a case in which ICC ousted a dictator from his ruling. If the gentleman from the Bundeswehr can remind me such an example, I'll be very thankful.
Right now it's not the case, but if Omar al-Bashir is coming to Europe, he is immediately being detained. So I think this is quite the case.
Okay. Milosevic was ousted after a military intervention. Saddam was ousted after military intervention. Gaddafi was ousted after military intervention. All these guys need either a military intervention or a very strong movement from inside, as it was the case in Bulgaria, a strong movement from inside to be ousted. Soft measures and soft power does not help them to get out of what they're doing. Now, the raised hand was the lady over there. Would you identify yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Amy. You all know me by now, I think. I think my point was maybe a little bit more relevant to Dr. Pronk's comments. My worry is that when we constantly talk about international, a common international policy on Syria, that we're forgetting that we need to make sure that we understand that there is a common opinion within Syria itself, because I don't know about everybody else, but every BBC report I see on Syria, there's always sort of images of pro-Assad sort of supporters in the streets, and although the BBC always sort of counters this with this footage cannot be validated by the BBC, we can't just assume that it isn't real, that there aren't supporters there. And we can't just wade in because we believe that the majority of the population wants change to try and in place a democracy when we're ignoring that there could be some support there. So while we do need to do something to help the people that are obviously suffering, to assume that we know what's best has never been a popular strategy of the past, and I wouldn't want to encourage that anymore, especially coming from Britain. You know, I'm reluctant to support any ideas of we know what's best for a country that's miles away. That's just my point.
Thank you very much. And now the microphone goes to our host.
Yeah, thank you. I think we should have a little historical backdrop here. Maybe this will kind of like put this in focus. General Wesley Clark, I'm sure Mr. Yakis and Mr. Passy are familiar with him. He was the commanding general of the forces led to against the war against Yugoslavia. And General Wesley Clark is noted for a few things. One was there was an incident where the Russian army took over an airport, and his immediate response was to confront the Russians. And General, I think his name's Michael Jackson from the UK said he made a very famous statement, "Do you want me to start World War III? I'm not going to do it." So this was a precursor to what I'm now going to relate to you. In 2007, General Wesley Clark, the same general who led forces against Yugoslavia, the NATO forces against Yugoslavia, went on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. And he related an incident that happened at the Pentagon. He went to visit the Pentagon, and he was going down the hall, and a brigadier general came out to him and said, "Listen, man, you got to come into this office and listen to this." And so he went in and had a discussion with the general. The general showed him a list, and if you don't believe me, it's on the internet, and he says it's in his own words. He says there's this list of countries that we've got to invade, or that we're supposed to invade. Well, guess who's on this list? Well, Libya, Somalia, Iraq, Iran. In fact, Iran's the last country on the list. Now, I think it's important to raise the question about, well, who or what is behind the circumstances that may lead to these conditions? Now, there's no question that I have great criticism of the Syrian government, of my own government, in fact, of many of the governments that are on this planet. But it should be understood that people have an interest sometimes in fomenting unrest in other countries. Now, I am a Vietnam veteran, former member of the United States military, and I know what invasions do to the soldiers and also to the people that they inflict their misery upon. So I would say this, that we have to negotiate, that the conflict is not worth one innocent life, to me. Now that's a very daunting task, to say that you're going to extract a leader without bloodshed. That's a daunting task, and that's something that faces the whole world community. But just in closing, I just wanted to point out historically that this list exists, and it exists not because I say it exists, but because the former commander of NATO forces says it does. And so how does that play into the events that are unfolding now?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. Indeed, we have to negotiate, in particular with Russia and China. But Russia and China have the position that they have to a great extent because they see that the West is very shy. The West is very shy. The West is hesitant. The West does not have leadership in this case. And that's why the position of Russia and China are much harder than if we had stronger West leadership. We don't have in Europe personality like Tony Blair at this moment. We don't have even personality like Sarkozy. And Russia and China were very much encouraged by the vote of Germany on the Security Council on the resolution on Libya. So in the West, in the European Union, we do not have leadership. And speaking of international actions, it reminds me one very, very interesting case, very much humanitarian case. Some of us remember, but most of you do not remember what happened in Cambodia in the 70s. There was an awful regime of the Khmer Rouge, which massacred 1/3 of the population of the country. And at the end of the day, this regime was ousted by the Vietnamese army without any resolution, without any Security Council, without NATO, without European Union, without anything. And the wrong Communist Party in Vietnam did the right thing to liberate the Cambodian people from the Khmer Rouge. Well, we're coming close to the end, and Mark is now jumping in.
Sure, I'd like to ask a question to you, and we can go also a few minutes after 1, so time-wise we're okay. So I want to continue the discussion in the fullest sense. But I want to ask a question regarding the topic of the panel discussion, and in particular solutions. So economic bridges as a tool to promote peace and prosperity. I've always been admiring of the work of the Perez Center for Peace, because I think very much a lot of your methodology is in line with the topic of this panel discussion, in the sense through joint activity, in the case of Perez Center, for example, between Palestinians and Israelis. Now, the idea is if they're doing business together, if they have joint activity together, they're more likely also to actually have peace together as well, and really how one can sometimes bring peace through economic bridges. So I'd love to ask each of the panelists your opinion on this issue. Do you think that economic bridges can also serve as a vehicle for peace? And maybe you even have 1 or 2 specific examples where you have seen this actually bringing results. And maybe we could even begin with Tom, since I know the Perez Center is involved in this activity, and I'd love a response, if possible, from each of the panelists. Okay, Ms. Shupkas would like to add to that too. Okay.
Could I add an element to your question? Because economic interest, sometimes it's armament, it's weapons. And we notice that sometimes the West is selling weapons and the dictators are supported as long as they get used to the West. So please, in your answers, include this dimension. It's an economic dimension for the West.
Okay, so I'll start off perhaps referring to the things that Mark said. So it's true the Perez Center does, the title of this meeting does have to do with what the Perez Center does. We have an economics and business department which actually does exactly that. It brings mostly Israeli and Palestinians from the same business sector to meet, either to go through training together or to understand how the market is in a similar field in Israel and in Palestine. And these do create good friendships and good relations in a sense, but I think the title here has to do a bit about with what we've been talking about in terms of corporate social responsibility, and that has to do with, is profit enough of an incentive to create long-lasting relationships and peace? And I think to an extent it doesn't, and it has to be supplemented with some type of willingness and some type of community to go with these economic bridges. So they do play a part in bringing people together, but there has to be some sort of undercurrent of understanding. I think that has to do a lot with people-to-people relations and the work of civil societies. And it has a lot to do with what we talked about yesterday in youth unemployment. It has to do with youth, because I think, first of all, youth is a large sector in the Middle East. I think 60% of the people in the Middle East are under the age of 30, and about 1/3 of the population is between the ages of 15 and 24, which is youth. And I think that is, first of all, those are the people who started revolutions in the area and have shown that they have ability and willingness for change. But I think that's also the place where we see potential for cooperation. It's also a lot of uncertainty that has to do with that, but it is a potential. And I think that if we want to approach building bridges through economic relations, it has to do with what we discussed also yesterday in terms of economics, which is education. because a lot of the young people who discussed yesterday discussed the move from education and to the economic system as being a problematic transition. And through development and training, I think, and through education, I think Mr. Musa also referred to that as one of the important factors to eliminate poverty. I think it's one of the important factors also to create peaceful relations, and I think that could be a more effective place to build bridges through education that has to do with employment in the long run, but is currently more of a system where people can build mutual trust and mutual assets together. Now, obviously, to your comment, there is a lot of problematics when it comes to only economic profit, and it can be used to very problematic advances in terms of the West versus other societies. And that's why I think there has to be a mutual trust underlying the economic bridges that are built, and it cannot be just to do with larger forces who are leading economic bridges, but with societies themselves.
I want to make one comment for Erna's remarks. Actually, the title, of course, refers or implies the positive effect of the economic cooperation or involvement, whereas yours is the negative side of it, which is also very important. We see it at present in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia pays hundreds of millions of dollars to the United States to purchase weapons, and it channels, the Saudi Arabia channels them to the opposition. America is happy because there's economic return. German economy is doing very well there, weapons economy, weapons manufacturing. And Saudi Arabia is happy because they want to get rid of Bashar Assad. So this is the negative side. But we have to emphasize, this was the title of the meeting and the spirit perhaps of this panel, to what extent economic cooperation, or was it cooperation or something else? Economic what? Bridges. Economic bridges is perhaps the best method to smoothen the atmosphere, and it has longer effects on the relations, and it has to be encouraged in all circumstances. It works very well. So this is something that has to be borne in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I must say I'm very intrigued and very interested in learning some more about the peace program that Tom is involved with. Not only because I'm half Palestinian, but also because I come from a country too that has territorial issues with another country. In my case, it's Guatemala and Belize. And I do believe that economic bridges need to be forged in most instances to bring about solutions to certainly issues involving territory, involving claims to land, or whether it be from whatever the origin of the claim. And I would want to think that to some extent we are already seeing it beginning to work in Israel and its relation in trying to bring about the two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. I believe that is the direction, and I want to commend the work the Shimon Peres Foundation is doing in this regard, because I believe that is the direction that has perhaps the best chance of forging a peace in the Middle East. Because until we can settle that problem, quite frankly, no amount of Arab Spring is going to bring about peace in the Middle East. That, to me, I still believe that is at the heart of the problem in the Middle East. And I want to think that there are more and more Israeli people who feel the same way as well. And economic bridges, certainly, it has been playing a part to smooth the possibility for a solution in this unfounded claim that Guatemala has over my country, Belize. because we have open borders and we have trade between our two countries, and we have business people going there, and there are business people coming to our country, and yes, it's not involving at all a question of arms sales or anything like that, fortunately, because that would complicate the situation.
Sure. Next to you, behind you.
We have one region where economic bridges have proved to be a major tool promoting peace and prosperity. That's Europe. Yes? Never a war again on the European continent. That's why we built, not we, but my father and my grandfather, after 45, the European Economic Union. And gradually we went from coal and steel, agriculture, market, etc., finance. Now, it's difficult at the moment, but that was the idea. Not economic integration as an aim in itself, but in order to have peace and prosperity. And if you are very much dependent on each other in economic terms, then you don't fight anymore. That was the idea of Monnet and others. But it's different, of course, if you are using economic bridges as a tool to promote peace and prosperity with another country, which in itself is not democratic, not based on human rights, but a dictatorship. And you see in practice that economic bridges, intensifying economic relations with Sudan and Libya under Gaddafi and Syria under Assad and many other examples have not worked out as a tool to promote peace and prosperity. Something had to take place before. And as a matter of fact, in all these countries, it did strengthen the position of those who were in economic/political power, further oppressing their own people. So it is a bridge. But first you have to do something else. And that is mainly of a political character. So don't fool yourself that by means of further intensifying economic relations with countries which themselves are very undemocratic and not based on human rights, you will in the end be able to promote peace and prosperity. Many other conditions will have to be met, and to that extent, of course, Tom Dolev was quite right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pronk. I think that I personally very much agree with what you say about the European Union. You need a kind of common level of development and common values in order to leave the relations on economic bridges. It is very easy to have between Netherlands and Belgium these bridges. You practically have no differences between each other or the rest inside the European Union. The economic bridges can work sometimes and somewhere, but not always and everywhere. And for example, a typical example how economic bridges do not work is the embargo against Cuba. The embargo against Cuba is something which is helping the dictatorship there to flourish, and does not make it, does not ruin it at all. But this is a matter of internal politics of the United States. The economic bridges, as far as I see them, cannot replace other measures. They could be complementary, but not instead of other measures. And there is a very particular area of the economic bridges which I would like to underline. This is, these are the information technologies. If there is something that can really ruin a dictatorship, this is the information. And I'll tell you something from my own experience. In 2007, I was on a mission in North Korea. At that time, the American government told me, look, you, the Bulgarians, have past relationship with North Korea, which hasn't been ruined so far. So would you like to pass a message to the North Koreans that if they behave in the way in which the Libyans are behaving, they destroyed their WMD program, Weapons for Mass Destruction program at that time, we shall give them everything that we offer to the Libyans. Well, I said, difficult mission, but let us try. And in a small Bulgarian delegation, we pass the message, and the people in North Korea are open to listen from Bulgaria, because dozens of them were educated in Bulgaria. And they met me in a perfect Bulgarian language. They were speaking fluent Bulgarian in the government, in the parliament, all over North Korea. And we were part of a very, very big international effort. Very small part of a very big effort, but at the end of the day, the North Koreans agreed to blow up the cooling tower in Yongbyon, which is the producer for heavy water, which at the end of the day, the measures brought a result. It was trade diplomacy. Unfortunately, none of the dictators will give up dictatorship for trade obligations. But if my personal lesson from this mission was the following: North Korea is the most closed country ever, all over the world, I have ever learned of or seen or met or whatever. If the dictatorship there is solid, it is because the people do not have information. My mobile phone was taken on the airport and was delivered back to me when I was again at the airport. No mobile phones, no internet, no whatever. It is against the North Korean law to open your radio receivers, because if you open it, if you unscrew the screws, then you can change the frequency, and this is against the law. You have just one frequency to receive only the propaganda of the government, of the state radio. So if we as a West have stronger leadership, we would tell to the North Koreans, we shall be happy to support your government on one or another or third program, but what we want from you is to import mobile phones for the people and to open the internet access. This is something that can change the country, and this is the internal revolution is something that can replace the military intervention from outside. So we still have raised hands, which is good.
Just a quick comment and perspective. It's maybe a subtler issue, but I think we haven't discussed it at this conference yet. And that is the ramifications of an agreement that's based on economic goals, such as NAFTA. And what is left out from that agreement. So if you're aware of what NAFTA is, it's an agreement, economic agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and was put together by businessmen for the goal of creating economic prosperity. What was left out was any consideration of the effects on people and the migration that would be a consequence, a domino effect of that changing landscape economically, and also on the environment. And I just want to dovetail and say that, you know, it's education. I remember when NAFTA came through and I didn't catch those admissions. And so I was all for it, and go Mr. Clinton, President Clinton, you know. So I think we all have that responsibility to carefully look at these agreements and make sure they're founded on multiple layers of responsibility, both environmental, humanitarian, civil rights, human rights, and so forth.
Thank you very much. We very much look forward to have a NAFTA-EU agreement to open the free trade between the two friendly areas on both sides of the Atlantic. This will be a great day for the world. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, just a final comment. Based on the UN as the main framework of analysis for this type of interventions through the Security Council, I would like to know, I mean, I'm interested in knowing how the element of cultural diplomacy can play a role or have a synergy probably with representation in these decisions though. Because if you see the formation of the UN Security Council is only the P5 members and the other non-permanent members, and Guatemala just recently joined the non-permanent members, but I think the UN reform has been taken very slow since the Kofi Annan strategy from 2004, and I don't see how for other countries being represented there by like Asia or like Africa or Latin America in the P5 as a permanent member, you don't have really a saying, though, in a case like Syria. You have a saying by your country only, but it's not the same. It doesn't have the same weight as a UN resolution to a Security Council on how to act if an intervention is needed or not. So probably the Institute can also develop a little bit more about the cultural diplomacy element as being representative of all the world, not only some countries and some geographical areas, to have an analysis up to date on what to do. And of course my take will be on peace all the time, not on an intervention, but if it's necessary, I think the ICC solution that was proposed by the German colleague it's interesting though. Thank you.
I remember that I was representing Bulgaria on the Security Council together with Syria. Syria was also a member of the Security Council during our term. And we had a couple of resolutions in which we had 14 against 1, and the one was Syria. This indicated these early years that something will happen in Syria. And obviously, at the end of the day, it happens. Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're close to the end of our panel discussion. I would like to warmly thank our panelists from Israel, from Belize, and from Turkey, and to all of you for the active participation, and of course, to Mark Donfried and to the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, to Riemann, Rosie, and the whole team here who is preparing such a wonderful and satisfactory intellectual exercise which we have today. Thank you, Mark.